Chapter 1: The Town That Vanished. Jack Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his fingers drumming absently against the leather as he stared at the narrow road stretching ahead. The trees flanking the path stood unnaturally tall, their twisted branches interlocking overhead, casting eerie shadows beneath the dim afternoon light. His GPS had given up miles ago, flickering between blank screens and error messages. He exhaled, stealing a glance at the yellowed map on the passenger seat. The words Hollow Creek were circled in thick red ink, its name a ghost among the records. There was no official documentation of the town's existence. It appeared in no maps after 1974, as if the place had been erased from time. And yet, the rumors persisted. Jack had spent weeks piecing together fragments of a mystery no one wanted to acknowledge. A handful of missing persons cases, disconnected yet eerily similar. A police report from a man who claimed his brother vanished after driving down this very road. An old woman who swore she had lived in Hollow Creek as a child, only to wake up one morning and find the entire town gone. They took it, she had whispered, her wrinkled hands trembling around a chipped teacup. One night, I went to sleep in Hollow Creek. The next morning, it was like it had never been there at all. But I remember, and you should forget. Jack wasn't the type to forget. His car rumbled over a patch of cracked asphalt, jolting him forward. The air around him felt thick, as if the atmosphere itself resisted his presence. The trees pressed closer, the road narrowing until it became little more than a dirt path. Something about this place felt wrong. Then, suddenly, the road ended. Jack's foot slammed on the brake, his heart hammering against his ribs. A town stretched before him. Hollow Creek. He sat there for a long moment, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. His mind scrambled for logic. This town should not be here. Every modern map he had checked showed nothing but an expanse of untouched woodland. But there it was, a collection of buildings standing as if they had never left. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The town was silent, unnaturally so. No wind stirred the air, no birds chirped from the trees. Storefronts lined the street, their signs faded and peeling. An old gas station stood at the corner, its rusted pumps frozen in time. The cars parked along the curb were relics of the past, boxy 1970s models with dust-covered windshields and keys still in the ignitions. Everything looked abandoned, but not in the way that towns usually fall to ruin. There was no sign of decay, no vines creeping over the buildings, no shattered windows. It was as if everyone had simply walked away one night, leaving their lives frozen mid-step. Jack swallowed hard, unease curling in his stomach. He lifted his camera, snapping a few pictures. The lens captured too much silence, a movement. Jack's breath hitched. In the second-floor window of what looked like an old hotel, a curtain shifted. Someone, or something, was standing behind the glass. He squinted, pulse hammering. The figure was shadowed, their features obscured by the dim light. But there was no mistaking it. He was being watched. The air around him grew colder. He exhaled, watching as his breath fogged in front of him. Then, a sound. A whisper, soft, almost lost in the stillness. A voice that should have been impossible. "Welcome back, Jack." The blood in his veins turned to ice. Jack stumbled back, his heart slamming against his ribs. His mind scrambled for an explanation, for for some rational way to dismiss what he had just heard. But deep inside, where his thoughts could not reach, something old remembered. He had been here before. Chapter 2. A Road That Shouldn't Exist. Jack Carter sat frozen in place, his heart still pounding from the whisper that had slid through the silent town like a ghost's breath. "Welcome back, Jack." The words clung to him, lingering in the still air. He forced himself to take a slow, steady breath, trying to shake the unnatural chill crawling up his spine. No one should know his name. He turned his gaze back to the hotel window. The figure behind the glass was gone. The curtain hung motionless, as if nothing had disturbed it. His rational mind told him it was probably just his imagination, just a shadow, a trick of the light. But he knew better. Jack had spent his career chasing urban legends, digging into forgotten places, listening to people tell stories of the impossible. He never truly believed any of them until now. A town that vanished, a road that didn't exist, a whisper that shouldn't have known his name. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. No signal, no GPS, no connection to the outside world. He stared at the screen, his own reflection looking back at him, warped by the dim light. For the first time in his life, he wanted to turn back, but the road he had taken to get here was gone. Jack's stomach twisted as he turned to look behind him. Where there had once been a narrow, overgrown path leading into a hollow creek, there was now only forest. Thick, unbroken, endless trees stretched into the distance, their dark forms pressing together like silent sentinels. No road, no tire tracks, nothing. His pulse thundered in his ears. That wasn't possible. He had driven here. He had followed the map. He had taken sharp turns, avoided potholes, felt the rumble of gravel beneath his tires. And now, it was as if the road had never existed. Jack took a shaky step forward, his boots crunching against dead leaves. He walked in the direction where the road should have been, pushing through the underbrush, his breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. He moved faster, breaking into a jog, then a run. But the trees never ended. He turned, disoriented, realizing that Hollow Creek was still right behind him. No matter how far he ran, no matter how fast he moved, the town remained at his back, waiting. Jack inhaled sharply, his hands trembling. He needed to think. Panic wouldn't help him. He had been in strange situations before. Abandoned buildings, hidden tunnels, even cult hideouts, but nothing like this. He forced himself to calm down, to analyze. Something didn't want him to leave. His best option was to find someone. Someone had whispered his name. Someone had been standing in that window. That meant he wasn't alone. He turned back toward the town, his mind racing. The silence was oppressive, pressing against his ears like a weight. He walked cautiously down the cracked pavement, past rusted street signs and lifeless shops. A grocery store stood on the corner. The shelves inside were fully stocked, but the food was decades old, untouched, the packaging yellowed with age. A barber shop's door hung open, the smell of dust thick in the air. A diner's neon sign still flickered, humming faintly despite the power lines looking long abandoned. Everything was too intact. Then, in the distance, something moved. Jack's breath caught as he saw a figure stepping onto the main road. It was a woman. She wore a pale blue dress, her hair curled in an old-fashioned style, like something from a 1970s magazine. She stood perfectly still, watching him with wide, unreadable eyes. Jack hesitated, then forced himself forward. "Hey!" His voice echoed through the empty town, unnatural in the silence. The woman didn't move. He stepped closer, his pulse hammering. "Do you live here?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. "My name is Jack Carter. You're late." Jack froze. Her voice was soft, almost distant, but there was certainty in it, as if she had been waiting for him, as if she knew him. His mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, the air shifted. A deep hum rose from the ground, vibrating through the pavement. The building shuddered slightly, as though the town itself had inhaled. Jack's vision blurred for half a second. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus. The woman was gone, vanished, like she had never been there. Jack's skin prickled. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. And somewhere in the distance, just beneath the hum of the town, he heard something else. A sound rising from the ground. A chorus of voices, whispering, calling his name. Chapter 3. Welcome back, stranger. Jack Carter stood frozen in the middle of the street, his breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. The woman in the blue dress was gone. 1 second she had been there, staring at him, speaking to him, and the next, the town had shifted, like a trick of the light, and she had vanished into thin air. No footsteps, no retreating figure, nothing. The humming beneath the ground had faded now, but a strange energy lingered in the air. Jack swallowed hard, feeling his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. He had been in eerie places before, but Hollow Creek was different. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't a ghost town, either. It was waiting. The buildings loomed around him in eerie silence. Faded storefronts lined the street, their old-fashioned signs still intact. The bakery advertised fresh bread for 35 cents. A record shop displayed a new arrival poster for the Carpenters' 1974 album. Everything was too well preserved, as if the town had been frozen in time. Jack took a deep breath, forcing his feet to move. If the woman had disappeared, that meant she had gone somewhere. He needed to find out where. He scanned the street, his eyes landing on the old hotel at the far end of town. It was the same building where he had seen the curtain shift in the second-floor window. If anyone was here, if anyone had whispered his name, it was inside. Jack crossed the cracked pavement, his boots echoing against the silence. The hotel's sign dangled from rusted chains, the letters spelling out the Hollow Creek Inn, barely legible beneath layers of grime. He hesitated at the entrance. The double doors were slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A faint smell of dust and something older drifted from within. Jack pushed the door open. The lobby was dimly lit, the light filtering through dirt-covered windows, casting eerie streaks across the wooden floor. A grand chandelier hung above, its crystals coated in dust. But what sent a chill down Jack's spine was the front desk. A small brass bell sat on the counter next to an open guest book. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, yet fresh, like someone had been writing in it just recently. Jack stepped closer, his eyes locked onto the last name in the book, his own name. Jack Carter, room 207. His blood turned to ice. No, that wasn't possible. He had never been here before. He had never checked into this hotel. And yet, there it was. His name, written in the neat cursive handwriting. The ink looked fresh, like it had been written only moments ago. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he reached out to touch the page. The paper was cold beneath his fingertips, real and solid. His breathing grew shallow. "Sir?" Jack whirled around. A man stood behind the front desk. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly pressed black vest over a white shirt. His face was eerily smooth, his dark hair slicked back with precision. Everything about him was pristine, except for his eyes. They were too dark, like deep, bottomless wells. Jack's mouth went dry. "Who are you?" The man smiled politely, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "You already know that, Mr. Carter." Jack's skin crawled. "I don't," he said carefully. The man tilted his head slightly. "You must be tired from your journey." His voice was smooth, too calm. "Your room is ready, 207, just as you requested." Jack felt the ground shift beneath him. This was wrong. All of this was wrong. "I never requested a room," Jack said slowly. The man's smile didn't falter. "Are you sure?" Jack's pulse roared in his ears. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something inside him whispered, "You've done this before." He took a slow step back. "I think I'll be leaving now." The man behind the desk sighed, as if Jack had disappointed him. "I'm afraid that's not possible." Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Excuse me." The man tapped the guest book with one pale finger. "You checked in," he said simply. A cold shudder ran down Jack's spine. His name was in the book, written in ink, as if he had already made the choice to stay. The man stepped out from behind the desk. "Your room is waiting, Mr. Carter." Jack took another step back. "I'm not staying." The man didn't react. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. "Room 207. He placed it on the counter. "You'll remember soon," he said quietly. Jack's fingers twitched. Every instinct told him not to take that key. But something pulled at him, a pressure in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He had two choices: take the key or run. The man behind the counter simply smiled, and from somewhere deep within the hotel, a door creaked open, as if something inside was waiting for him to step through. Chapter 4, Room 207. Jack Carter stared at the key on the counter. The small brass tag gleamed under the dim light, the numbers 207 etched deep into its surface. The man behind the desk, the clerk, stood unnervingly still, his two dark eyes locked onto Jack with quiet amusement. Jack's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "You checked in," the clerk had said, but he hadn't. Had he? Something about this place pulled at him, like invisible threads tightening around his limbs. The longer he stood there, the harder it became to move, as if the hotel expected him to stay. Jack took a slow breath, forcing himself to focus. If he wanted answers, he needed to keep his head. He wasn't trapped here. Not yet. "Fine," Jack muttered, snatching the key. "But if this is some kind of game, I'm not playing." The clerk's smile never wavered. "Of course, Mr. Carter. Enjoy your stay." Jack turned and strode toward the staircase, his boots echoing against the polished wooden floor. The grand staircase curved upward into the darkness above. Every step felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing down on him. The second-floor hallway was dimly lit, the flickering wall sconces casting long, shifting shadows. The air smelled of dust and old wood, tinged with something faintly metallic. The carpet beneath his feet was thick, muffling his steps. Then he saw it. Room 207. The door stood at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. Jack hesitated. Had someone left it open? Or had it been waiting for him? A chill crept down his spine. He tightened his grip on the key, stepping closer. The brass numbers on the door glinted dully in the low light. He pushed the door open. The room was exactly how he expected it to be. A single bed with neatly tucked sheets, a small wooden nightstand, an old rotary phone resting beside a brass lamp. Heavy curtains drawn over the window, shutting out the outside world. And on the desk against the far wall, a stack of photographs. Jack's breath caught. He crossed the room, his hands unsteady as he picked up the top photo. It was him, standing in front of the Hollow Creek Inn, staring up at the hotel just as he had earlier today. But the photograph was old, its edges yellowed, its surface faded. The clothes he wore in the picture were ones he hadn't worn in years. His throat tightened. He flipped to the next photograph. Another him, younger, maybe 10 years ago, standing in the same spot. The next one, even younger, different clothes, different time, always in front of this hotel. Jack's stomach twisted. He flipped through the stack faster, his fingers shaking. The dates on the backs of the photographs spanned decades. That wasn't possible. A thick, suffocating dread settled over him. How was his face in these photographs? How had he been here before, when he had no memory of it? A soft creak broke the silence. Jack's head snapped up. The closet door across the room had opened an inch. His pulse roared in his ears. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. His muscles screamed at him to run, but he stepped forward, his fingers curling into fists. He reached for the closet door, and then a whisper from inside the closet. "You shouldn't have come back." Jack yanked the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty, but the whisper still lingered in the air, curling around him like a breath from something unseen. Jack stumbled backward, his hands clammy. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just heard, what he had just seen. The photographs, the voice, and then the rotary phone on the nightstand rang, a sharp, jarring sound that shattered the silence. Jack's blood ran cold. He turned toward the phone, his body stiff with fear. The phone kept ringing, loud, insistent, demanding to be answered. Jack took a slow, unsteady step forward. His hand trembled as he lifted the receiver. He pressed it to his ear. Silence. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. His own. "Get out, now, before it takes you again." The line went dead. Chapter 5. The Thing in the Mirror. Jack Carter stood motionless, the dead phone still pressed against his ear. His own voice, distorted, urgent, echoed in his mind. "Get out, now, before it takes you again." His breath came in quick, shallow bursts. His fingers tightened around the receiver, as if holding on to something real would anchor him. But reality here was warped. The photographs, the whisper in the closet, the call from himself. None of this made sense. Jack forced himself to move, placing the phone back on the nightstand with an unsteady hand. He needed to think. What did again mean? If he had been here before, why didn't he remember? He turned toward the desk, his eyes scanning the photographs once more. He needed to find something, a clue, a name, a sign that would explain what the hell was happening. Then he saw it. A mirror stood in the corner of the room, tall and old, its wooden frame carved with intricate floral patterns. It hadn't been there before, had it? Jack took a slow step toward it. His reflection moved with him, almost too perfectly. The glass was too clean, too smooth. almost like a sheet of water frozen in time. Then, his reflection didn't stop when he did. Jack's stomach twisted. His breath hitched as he watched himself take one more step forward, even though he hadn't moved. The Jack in the mirror was staring back at him, but there was something wrong with his eyes. They were darker, hollow, like twin voids pulling in the dim light of the room. Jack took an instinctive step back. His reflection did not. Jack's chest tightened. This wasn't possible. Then, slowly, deliberately, his reflection tilted its head to one side. The movement was unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. A voice slithered from the glass. "You're running out of time, Jack." Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. His throat was dry, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough. The reflection's lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. "You." Jack's blood turned to ice. Then the reflection reached out. Jack stumbled back as the hand in the mirror pressed against the glass, but only from the inside. The surface rippled, shifting like liquid. Fingers, his own fingers, pushed against it, trying to force their way through. A sharp crack splintered through the room. Jack turned toward the closet. The door was open again, wider this time. A shadow slithered out, stretching across the floor toward him. The mirror behind him began to shake violently, its surface rippling like a disturbed pond. His reflection's grin widened, its lips parting, revealing too many teeth. A sound filled the room. Something was laughing, but it wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from inside the closet. Jack's instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but as he turned toward the door, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, the entire room was swallowed by darkness. And in that single second, Jack felt something cold wrap around his wrist. A hand pulling him toward the mirror. Chapter 6. The Other Side. Jack Carter barely had time to react. The cold grip on his wrist tightened, yanking him toward the mirror with unnatural force. His boot scraped against the wooden floor, but it was like trying to resist an ocean current. Something was pulling him in. The surface of the mirror rippled violently, distorting his reflection. His own face stared back at him, but the hollow-eyed version of himself inside the glass no longer smiled. Instead, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." Then, the mirror swallowed him whole. Jack fell. It wasn't like falling through space or down a staircase. It was worse, like being pulled through something dense and liquid, yet freezing cold. His lungs burned, his mind screamed, but there was no air to gasp. He tried to twist, to claw his way back, but the pull was too strong. Then, he hit the ground. Jack's body slammed onto a cold, hard surface. His vision swam as he coughed violently, gasping for breath. The impact sent a shockwave of pain up his spine, but he was alive. Slowly, he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, his breath ragged. The floor beneath him was smooth, too smooth, like glass. No, not glass, mirror. Jack's stomach twisted as he looked around. He was in the same room, room 207. The bed, the nightstand, the closet, everything was in its place. But something was wrong. The light was dimmer, casting long, stretched-out shadows. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. It smelled like dust and decay. And then he saw the biggest difference. The door was gone. Where the entrance had been, there was now only a wall. Jack's pulse hammered. He turned toward the window and his stomach dropped. The view outside was wrong. Instead of the empty streets of Hollow Creek, The town outside the window looked alive. Lights flickered in the shops. Silhouettes of people moved behind fogged-up windows. A horse-drawn carriage rolled down the cobbled street below. It was like staring into a frozen moment in time, a town that should have been dead, still living. Jack's breathing grew shallow. This wasn't Hollow Creek. It was Hollow Creek's reflection. A soft knock sounded behind him. Jack whipped around. The closet door was open. His pulse roared in his ears as he stepped forward. He had to see. The inside of the closet was dark, a yawning abyss that seemed to stretch too deep for such a small space. Jack swallowed hard. Hello. Silence. Then, something moved inside. A shape. No, a person. A woman stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. Her blue dress was familiar. So was her face. Jack's breath caught. The woman from the street, the one who had called his name. Up close, her features were sharper. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent. Her hair, dark and sleek, cascaded down her back. And her eyes, God, her eyes. They were just like his reflections, hollow, wrong. You finally made it, she whispered. Jack's throat went dry. He took a slow step back. Who are you? The woman's lips curled into a sad smile. You don't remember, do you? Jack's pulse quickened. Remember what? Her gaze softened. That you've been here before. Jack stiffened. No, he muttered. That's not possible. But the moment the words left his lips, something inside him shifted. Memories, fragments, flashed through his mind. Blurred images of this very room. The same bed, the same nightstand, the same closet, and her, standing exactly where she was now. His stomach twisted. You don't belong here, she whispered, stepping closer. You need to leave, before it finds you. Jack's breath hitched. Before what finds me? A long, dreadful pause. Then, the thing that brought you back. Jack's skin prickled. The mirror. The woman shook her head. No. What's inside it? The air in the room shifted. A low, guttural growl rumbled from somewhere deep within the walls. The woman's head snapped toward the mirror. It knows you're here. Jack turned to look, and his stomach turned to ice. The mirror had changed. His reflection was still there, but it wasn't just his. Shapes moved behind it. Figures, dark, twisted things that pressed against the glass like prisoners behind a thin sheet of ice. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps. What the hell are those? The woman grabbed his arm. You don't have time. We have to. The mirror cracked. A deep, splintering sound echoed through the room. The figures inside the glass twitched, their movements jerky, unnatural. Then, one of them stepped through. Jack stumbled backward as something emerged from the mirror. It was tall, too tall, its limbs stretching as if its bones were bending in the wrong directions. Its face was featureless, a smooth expanse of skin except for its mouth, a wide, gaping void that stretched too far. Jack's mind screamed at him to move, but he was frozen. The creature's head tilted as it took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The woman's grip tightened on his arm. Run. Jack didn't hesitate. He bolted for the closet, diving into the darkness. The woman followed, slamming the door shut behind them. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a deafening bang as something slammed against the door. Jack's heart pounded. His hands fumbled in the darkness. Where does this lead? The woman's voice was tight. Somewhere safer, if we're lucky. Jack swallowed hard. And if we're not? Another bang. This time, the wood splintered. The woman exhaled. Then we don't make it out at all. Chapter 7. The Hollow Corridor. A loud crack split the air as the closet door splintered behind them. Jack barely had time to react before the woman grabbed his arm and pulled him deeper into the darkness. "Move," she hissed. Jack stumbled forward, barely able to see anything in the pitch-black space. The air was thick, damp, and wrong, like they weren't in the hotel anymore. His fingers grazed a wall, but instead of wood, it felt cold and smooth. Glass. Behind them, the thing that had crawled from the mirror let out a deep, unnatural gurgling sound. Jack didn't dare turn around. They ran. The corridor stretched endlessly, the only sound their hurried footsteps and the occasional raspy breath of something that wasn't them. Jack risked a glance over his shoulder. The creature wasn't chasing them. It was watching. Its featureless face remained still, but its mouth quivered, stretching unnaturally wide, as if tasting the air. Then, the walls flickered. Jack's stomach turned as he saw reflections of himself along the corridor's walls. Hundreds of them, each one slightly different. Some looked just like him, terrified and running, but others, some of the reflections weren't running at all. They stood still, watching, smiling. One reached out and pressed its hand against the glass, and then it stepped through. Jack barely dodged as a twisted version of himself lunged from the wall. Its skin was pale, its lips curled into a jagged grin. Its eyes were completely black. Jack barely had time to register what was happening before the woman yanked him forward. "Don't stop, it's already breaking through." The creature behind them let out a shrieking wail, the sound bouncing off the endless corridor. Jack forced himself to run faster. His legs screamed in protest, but the corridor seemed endless, stretching on into infinity. The reflections along the glass grew worse. Some showed him, but older, decayed. Others showed versions of himself he didn't recognize. Different clothes, different times, but always here, always in this corridor. It was like this place had been holding on to every version of him that had ever stepped inside. Jack's breath hitched. How many times had he been here before? Then, a door. Up ahead, standing alone in the empty corridor, a single wooden door waited. The woman didn't hesitate. She ripped it open, shoving Jack through first. He stumbled inside, nearly falling, as she slammed the door shut behind them. Silence. Jack collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. His heart pounded so hard, he thought it might burst. The woman stood beside him, her own breathing ragged. For the first time, Jack had a moment to process. Where the hell were they? The room they had entered was identical to room 207. The same furniture, the same nightstand, even the same mirror. But something was off. Jack swallowed hard, stepping forward. His eyes flicked to the window. It was Hollow Creek, but it wasn't. The town outside was frozen in place. The people in the street weren't moving. The carriage was stopped mid-roll. Even the flickering lanterns seemed suspended in time. The woman exhaled sharply. "Damn it!" Jack turned to her. "What the hell is going on?" She didn't answer right away. She walked to the mirror, her expression unreadable. "This place," she murmured. "It's a trap." Jack's jaw clenched. "You mean the hotel?" She shook her head. "No, the reflection." Jack stared at her. "The what?" She turned toward him. "The hollow corridor, the place we just ran through, connects this world to the real one. We're still trapped inside the hotel's reflection." Jack's stomach twisted. You're saying this whole place is just a... what? A copy? More than that, she said quietly. It's a prison. Jack clenched his fists. Why me? He demanded. Why do I keep seeing myself in those damn mirrors? Why do I have photos of myself in this hotel from decades ago? She hesitated. You don't remember because the hotel won't let you. Jack's breath caught. What do you mean? She looked at him, her expression laced with something close to pity. You're not the first version of yourself to be here, she said, and you won't be the last. Jack felt the ground sway beneath him. Every time you enter this place, she continued, you forget the last time. You always end up back here. The hotel keeps bringing you back. Jack shook his head. No, that's not possible. But the memories, the fragments, they had started creeping in. The feeling of déjà vu, the familiarity of this room. Jack took a shaky step back. No, I'd remember. Then, the mirror behind them rippled. Jack froze. The woman's eyes widened. It's here. A hand slammed against the glass. Jack turned, his blood running cold. His reflection was moving on its own again. But this time, it wasn't just a reflection. The thing on the other side was stepping through. Chapter 8. The Mirror Born. A deep, unnatural crack split through the mirror's surface as the thing inside pressed forward. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. The figure stepping through the glass looked exactly like him. Same face, same clothes, same terrified expression. But something was wrong. Its eyes were black voids, empty and hungry. Its skin had an unnatural paleness, almost like it wasn't made of flesh at all. And worst of all, it was smiling. A slow, jagged grin spread across its face, stretching too wide, as if its skin was too tight for its skull. Then, in a voice identical to Jack's, it whispered, "Finally." Jack stumbled backward. What the hell is that? The woman beside him, the only other living soul in this nightmare, grabbed his wrist. Her grip was ice cold. "Don't look at it," she said urgently. "Don't listen. It's not you." The mirror continued to crack and warp as more shapes moved behind the glass. Jack's stomach churned. There were more. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Distorted versions of himself, each slightly different. Some were younger, some older. Some had wounds that should have killed them. Some weren't human at all. They all stood in the glass, their heads twitching, whispering in voices that sounded like his own. "Come back. You left us here. You don't deserve to leave." Jack's mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. His heart pounded like a war drum. The woman jerked his arm. "We need to." Too late. The mirror exploded outward. A shower of glass rained across the room as the mirror-born lunged forward, its too wide grin splitting open into something inhuman. Jack barely had time to raise his arms before the thing collided with him. They crashed to the ground, rolling across the wooden floor. Jack thrashed, trying to push the thing off him, but it was too strong. It pinned him down, its cold fingers wrapping around his throat. Jack gasped, his vision blurred. His lungs screamed for air. The thing leaned in close, its lifeless black eyes staring directly into his. And then, it spoke, not in whispers, not in distorted echoes, in his own voice. "You left me," it hissed. "You left us." Jack's mind reeled. Us. He shoved with all his strength, breaking the thing's grip just enough to roll away. He scrambled backward, gasping, his hand finding a piece of shattered glass on the floor. The thing moved fast. Jack barely had time to react before it lunged again. He didn't think, he just swung. The sharp edge of the glass sliced into its face. The creature shrieked, but there was no blood. Instead, its skin split open like cracked porcelain, revealing nothing underneath. Just a hollow void. It stumbled back, twitching violently. Jack didn't wait. He turned, grabbed the woman's arm, and ran. They burst into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind them. Jack's chest heaved. His hands trembled. The woman grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. Listen to me. That thing, it's not just a monster, it's part of you. Jack's head spun. What does that mean? She exhaled sharply. This place, the reflection, it's been feeding off every version of you that's ever been trapped here. That thing is made of all the Jacks that never escaped. Jack's blood ran cold. The whispers, the endless reflections, the feeling of déjà vu. He swallowed hard. Then how the hell do we stop it? The woman's jaw tightened. We don't. Jack's breath caught. What? The hallway lights flickered. A deep, rumbling growl came from behind the door. Jack's stomach twisted. The Mirror-born wasn't dead. And worse, it wasn't alone. Chapter 9. The Forgotten Ones. The hallway shuddered. Jack felt the vibration beneath his feet, a deep, unnatural tremor that made his stomach twist. The door behind them bulged outward, the wood groaning as something on the other side tried to force its way through. The woman grabbed Jack's wrist. Run. Jack didn't hesitate. They sprinted down the endless corridor, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The flickering gas lamps above cast twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own, stretching toward them like grasping fingers. Behind them, the door exploded outward. Jack risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. It wasn't just one anymore. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Figures that looked like him, crawling from the shattered mirror world. Some were barely human, twisted, broken things with empty sockets where eyes should have been. Others had gaping mouths, stretching too wide, whispering his name in his own voice. Jack, come back. You belong here. His chest tightened, his legs burned, but he kept running. The woman pulled him forward, her grip ice cold as they turned a sharp corner. Jack's mind raced. There had to be a way out. The front door, he gasped. She shook her head. Won't work. The hotel won't let you leave that way. Jack's heart pounded. Then where? She didn't answer. Instead, she dragged him toward another door, one that looked just like the others. But as she reached for the handle, Jack noticed something strange. The door wasn't real. It shimmered like a mirage, flickering in and out of existence, like it wasn't meant to be here. The woman hesitated for the briefest moment. Then she grabbed the handle, and the world collapsed around them. Darkness. For a moment, Jack felt nothing. No weight, no breath, just a void pulling him deeper. Then, a cold, hollow whisper. You are not the first. Jack gasped as he fell forward, slamming onto a hard surface. His lungs burned as he sucked in air. He wasn't in the hotel anymore. Jack pushed himself up, blinking against the dim light. They were in a massive circular chamber, surrounded by cracked mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling. The air was thick with dust, the scent of something old and rotting lingering in his nostrils. And then he saw them, figures, not just reflections, but people, or at least they had been once. They stood along the walls, their bodies Others were warped and twisted, their features melting into the glass, their hands reaching out, as if trying to escape. Jack's stomach lurched. They were him. Hundreds of versions of himself, trapped inside the mirrors, their faces frozen in horror. His breath caught in his throat. How? The woman stepped beside him, her voice quiet. These are the ones who never got out. Jack's hands trembled. He stared at his own reflection, expecting it to move on its own. But it didn't. It was just him. But then one of the figures turned its head. Jack's blood ran cold. It was one of his past selves, a version of him that looked decades older, his face sunken, his eyes hollow. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, only a whisper, like wind through broken glass. You can still leave. Jack swallowed hard. How? The old reflection raised a shaking hand, pointing toward the center of the room. Jack turned and saw the grand mirror. It was different from the others, taller, wider, its frame intricately carved with symbols he didn't recognize. The glass was black as ink, rippling slightly, as if it were made of liquid. And in its depths, Jack saw himself, not the distorted creatures, not the broken reflections. Him, the real him, a way out. But as Jack took a step forward, the mirror-born stepped out from the shadows. It stood between him and the mirror, its black eyes gleaming. The twisted, broken versions of himself surged forward, surrounding him. The whispering grew louder. You can still leave, but not all of you. Jack's pulse spiked. Not all of him. He turned to the woman, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. She already knew. Jack understood the truth. To escape, he had to leave part of himself behind. A sacrifice. But what part? And would he still be Jack when he got out? Chapter 10. The Choice. The mirror-born stepped closer, its black void-like eyes fixed on Jack. The whispers around him grew louder, voices that sounded like his own, begging, pleading, threatening. Stay. You don't deserve to leave. Not all of you can go. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. The grand mirror behind the mirror-born rippled like liquid shadow, showing his true self, a way out. But between him and it stood the twisted reflections, dozens of them, shifting and writhing in the dim light. His body tensed. There had to be a way to get past them. The woman, his only ally in this nightmare, was unnaturally still. Jack turned to her, searching for an answer in her expression, but she wouldn't meet his gaze. You already knew, didn't you? Jack's voice was hoarse. Her shoulders tightened. She exhaled shakily. Yes. Jack's fists clenched. Tell me, what does it mean? Not all of me can leave. Her gaze finally lifted to meet his. There was sorrow there, and something else. Regret. Every version of you that has ever set foot in this place is still here, she murmured. Some of them are trapped in the mirrors. Others became something else. She gestured toward the mirror-born, the thing that wore his face but wasn't him. Jack's stomach twisted. He looked at the grotesque figures surrounding them, the twisted, broken versions of himself, the forgotten ones. You're saying that if I leave, I have to leave, one of me behind. The woman's silence was enough. A cold dread settled in Jack's chest. This wasn't a simple escape. It was a trade. Something had to stay. But which part? He turned back to the mirror-born, watching as it tilted its head, its cracked grin widening. Come back, Jack. Jack shook his head. No. It lunged. Jack dodged, rolling to the side as its claw-like fingers past his face, nearly taking his eye out. The other reflections closed in, hands reaching, whispering, pulling. "We are you. You are us." Jack grabbed a shard of broken mirror from the ground and swung. The glass sliced through one of the reflections, but instead of bleeding, it shattered, its body collapsing into jagged fragments. The others hesitated, their whispering voices faltering. Jack's mind raced. They could be broken. He had a chance. He turned toward the Grand Mur, his way out, but the Mirrorborn blocked his path, its black, hollow eyes burning into him. Jack's grip tightened around the glass shard. One of us has to stay. Then, a thought struck him. What if it wasn't him that had to stay? What if he could leave behind the part of himself that didn't belong? Jack's eyes locked onto the Mirrorborn. "What if I leave you?" he whispered. The thing's grin vanished. Jack took a slow step forward. "You're the part of me that got trapped here, aren't you? The part that gave in." The Mirrorborn's expression twitched. The other reflections stirred, uneasy. Jack's heart pounded. He was right. He took another step. "You were me once, but you're not me anymore." The Mirrorborn snarled, its grin twisting in fury. The other reflections shrank back, their whispers turning into panicked murmurs. Jack gritted his teeth. "I don't have to stay." He raised the glass shard. "You do." The Mirrorborn screamed. It lunged. Jack ran forward and plunged the glass into its chest. A deafening silence filled the chamber. The Mirrorborn staggered, its hollow eyes widening in shock. The black void within it cracked, fractures spreading across its body like breaking porcelain. It collapsed, its form splitting into 1,000 tiny shards, each piece dissolving into shadow. The other reflections wailed, their distorted bodies collapsing into the mirrors, swallowed by the glass like ripples in water. The chamber trembled. Jack turned toward the grand mirror, his reflection still standing within it, waiting. The woman looked at him. "Go." Jack hesitated. "What about you?" Her expression softened. "I never had a way out." Jack's chest tightened. He wanted to ask what she meant, but there was no time. The chamber was collapsing. The mirrors shattered, darkness swelling in, swallowing the room piece by piece. Jack turned and stepped into the mirror. Light, a blinding, overwhelming light. Then, nothing. Chapter 11, The Wrong Side of the Mirror. Jack gasped. The blinding light faded, and he stumbled forward, his knees hitting cold wooden floorboards. His breath came in ragged, desperate gulps. He was out. The hotel's grand chamber, the endless mirrors, the whispers, all gone. Jack looked up. He was standing in a hallway, not the eerie, shifting corridors of the Holloway Grand. This was different. The wallpaper was familiar, deep burgundy with gold patterns, slightly worn at the edges. The wooden floors creaked softly beneath his weight. A dim chandelier flickered overhead, casting a warm, flickering glow. It looked like his childhood home. Jack's stomach twisted. No, that's impossible. He hadn't seen this place in over 20 years. The house had burned down when he was a child, the fire swallowing everything. His bedroom, the old staircase, the scent of his mother's lavender perfume still lingering in the halls. But now, it was here, intact, untouched. Jack's fingers tightened around the key in his palm. Something was wrong. He turned and saw a mirror hanging on the wall. His own reflection stared back at him. At first, everything seemed normal. His pale skin, his tousled brown hair, the faint scar above his eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bike as a kid. But then, his reflection blinked. Jack hadn't. A chill crawled up his spine. His reflection tilted its head, studying him. Its eyes seemed darker. Jack took a slow step forward. His reflection didn't move. A cold knot of dread twisted in his gut. Something wasn't right. Jack hesitated. Then, cautiously, he reached out a hand, and his reflection didn't match him. Instead of mirroring his movements, it raised its own hand, a second too late. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "That's not me." His reflection's lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. Then it spoke. "Are you sure you made it out, Jack?" Jack's blood turned to ice. His reflection was still smiling, but now its grin was too wide, stretching too far. The skin around its mouth cracked like broken porcelain, revealing something dark underneath. Jack's chest tightened. This isn't real. It's another trick. He took a step back, and then the lights flickered. The mirror shook, its surface rippling like water. The reflection reached forward, its fingers pressing against the glass from the inside. The smile widened. "Are you sure you're on the right side?" Then, the glass shattered. Jack stumbled back as shards rained down, the sound ringing in his ears. The mirror frame stood empty, now nothing more than a black, gaping hole. And from the darkness, something stepped out. It looked like him, but it wasn't. Its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, its limbs bending at angles they shouldn't. Its eyes were too black, its smile too sharp. Jack's pulse spiked. His reflection had come through, and now it was free. Chapter 12. The final reflection. Jack staggered backward, his breath sharp and uneven. His reflection stood before him, twisted, wrong, but undeniably him. Its too wide grin stretched across its face, the cracks in its skin revealing something dark underneath, like a hollow shell barely holding itself together. The air felt heavy, thick with something Jack couldn't name. "You don't belong here, Jack." The thing's voice was his own, but layered, distorted, as if someone had stacked 100 versions of it on top of each other. Jack's fists clenched. "I'm not playing your game." His reflection tilted its head, eyes glinting with something almost amused. "Oh, but you already have." The house around them groaned, the walls shifting. Shadows flickered across the floorboards, moving against the light. Jack turned, his heart hammering. He needed a way out, but there was no door, no windows, nothing except the mirror frame behind his reflection. An empty, gaping hole leading into blackness. Jack's stomach twisted. "I came through the mirror," he thought. So maybe. He took a cautious step toward it. His reflection moved too, matching him, blocking the way. Jack swallowed hard. It knew. "You can't leave," the reflection said, the grin never fading. "One of us has to stay." The words sent a cold spike of dread through Jack's chest. This was the choice. One Jack, one reflection. Only one could go back. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. His mind raced. There had to be a way to trick it, a way to... The reflection lunged. Jack dodged, barely escaping the clawed fingers that swiped inches from his throat. He stumbled, his back hitting the wall. The room shuddered. His reflection laughed. "You're getting slow." Jack gritted his teeth. Then he saw it, a shard of mirror lying on the floor. It was small, but sharp enough. Jack dived for it. The reflection moved fast, grabbing his arm, its grip icy cold, fingers digging into his skin. Jack twisted, slamming his elbow into its side. The reflection hissed, momentarily stunned. That was all Jack needed. With a sharp breath, he drove the shard into the reflection's chest. Crack! The reflection's eyes widened. Its grin finally faltered. No! Its voice broke, layers of whispers unraveling. The cracks spread, webbing out from the wound. Light spilled from them, blinding, searing light. The reflection screamed. Jack barely had time to react before the room collapsed inward, the walls shattering like glass, the darkness rushing toward him. He turned and ran, straight for the mirror frame, straight into the black void. And then everything was light. Jack gasped awake. He was lying on the ground. The cold, hard surface beneath him wasn't wooden floorboards. It was marble. Slowly, he pushed himself up. He was in the lobby of the Holloway Grand Hotel. The chandeliers flickered overhead. The grandfather clock ticked in the distance. Everything was normal, except the front doors were open. Jack's heart pounded. He turned, looking around. The receptionist's desk was empty. No staff, no guests, no sounds except the faint echo of his own breathing. He looked down. The mirror shard was still clutched in his hand. Jack swallowed hard. He didn't wait, didn't question it. He ran, through the open doors, into the cold night air, onto the empty road. The hotel loomed behind him, silent and waiting. Jack didn't look back. He kept running and running until the Holloway Grand was gone. Days later, Jack sat in his apartment, staring at his own reflection in the bathroom mirror. He had checked 100 times. Everything looked normal, but some nights, he swore he saw something move in the reflection. A delay, a flicker, and just for a second, a grin that wasn't his. The end.